Hello and welcome to the second last lecture on Look Back in Anger by John Osborne. So we've already had a few discussions on this, a few lectures on this particular drama where we discussed certain aspects of gender studies, masculinity studies, the very complex relationship between the political perspective and the gendered behavior in Look Back in Anger. So hopefully given you an idea of the cultural condition which produced this play, the political backdrop of this play, the politics of anger, the politics of melancholy, the politics of masculinity which pervades this particular play. And more specifically, we had looked at a particular scene in the previous lecture, if you remember, where we have studied actually the conversation between Alison Redfern and her father, Colonel Redfern, which revolved around Jimmy Porter. We talked about how Colonel Redfern represented or embodied a particular kind of masculinity, the colonial imperial masculinity, which is obviously on its way out. It doesn't understand the world around it. It's obviously not hegemonic anymore. It's not dominant anymore. It's confused. It's completely contaminated by different kinds of cultural factors. And obviously we have Jimmy Porter, who is a post-imperial kind of British masculinity, who never was hegemonic, never was dominant. And he sort of, in a very strange way, the two figures seem to have some kind of an empathetic relationship with each other. Both they seem to understand each other's disillusionment. So Jimmy says at one point that it must be a really bitter feeling for someone like Redfern to have fallen from grace, to have fallen from a certain dominant position which he once enjoyed as an imperial officer in India. And in his turn, Colonel Redfern seems to empathize with Jimmy, and he actually tells Alison that I sort of understand how Jimmy must be feeling at this point in time. Where we have this very interesting line said by Alison where she tells her father that you are disillusioned, you are angry, you are confused because everything has changed. Jimmy is confused because nothing has changed. Something must have gone wrong somewhere. And this particular line, which I picked up in the previous lecture, is a very political line because it sort of captures the entire cynicism, disillusion, and discontent that pervades Look Back in Anger. The political scenario, the political backdrop of Look Back in Anger is one of discontent, right? And it's against this discontented political backdrop that we must study the different gender behaviors, the different gender embodiments in Look Back in Anger. What kind of masculinity does Jimmy Porter represent? What kind of femininity does Alison Redfern represent? What kind of femininity does Helena Charles represent? The middle-class, manipulative kind of femininity which vacillates between a Christian belief system and a completely anti-Christian, anti-religious belief system, and how she sort of balances the two acts. And obviously a big part of Look Back in Anger is, if you're looking at a play from a gender perspective, a big part of Look Back in Anger is a performative perspective. To what extent do characters play a role within their roles? So Jimmy Porter, oftentimes in a play you'll find him breaking into different kinds of roles. So he obviously represents a certain kind of, masculinity in Look Back in Anger. But even within the play, frequently, he sort of breaks into caricatures of different kinds of masculinity, genteel masculinity, working class masculinity, revolutionary masculinity, radical masculinity, conservative masculinity. He performs the different roles, often parodies the different roles. So again, this very slippery relationship between performativity and parody, which goes on in Look Back in Anger, is something which we must pay attention to, especially if we're reading this particular play from a gender studies perspective. Now, what I'll do today is sort of hopefully giving you a preamble to the play, hopefully giving you an understanding of the politics of masculinity and femininity in the play. What I'll do today is look at the way in which the drama in Look Back in Anger, the plot in Look Back in Anger, the dramatic plot in Look Back in Anger, to what extent is that particular plot gendered? So we talk about the relationship between affect and gender. So for instance, when I say affect, I include anger, I include violence, I include disrespect, I include insult, I include feeling violated. So all these are different kinds of affect. So let's look at someone like Alison Redfern or Alison Porter in Look Back in Anger. To what extent is a femininity a construct of affect? So Alison Redfern can be seen in Look Back in Anger as a vessel of violence. Right? So she is someone, and I'm not talking about violence only at a physical, corporeal level, but also at an epistemic level, at a level of knowledge. That's why I use the word epistemic. So she embodies a departure from a certain kind of knowledge system into another kind of knowledge system which she cannot quite come to terms to. So if you look at the background of Alison Redfern, she obviously grew up in an imperial setting. She grew up in India as a daughter of an imperial officer stationed in India. And then, of course, she had to come back to England after India gained independence. And once she came back to England, she could not understand her own country. So ethnically, she's British. Nationally, she's British. But when she comes back to India, she cannot quite recognize Britain around her because she's never been there. She grew up in India, entirely in India. And she's very used to a certain kind of Britishness, a certain kind of British femininity, which is at odds to what the kind of femininity she's having to perform in England. So if you look at her kind of embodiment, the kind of femininity embodied by Alison Redfern in Look Back in Anger, you'll find quite clearly that she is someone who becomes a vessel for violence. So she becomes a receiver of violence in different kinds of perspectives. So she comes back to England and she doesn't quite recognize it. She doesn't quite fit into it. And she finds the entire genteel scenario, the genteel society around them to be quite stifling and claustrophobic. And that sort of makes her even more paranoid. And that sort of makes her almost desperate to depart from this kind of discourse, wherein comes in Jimmy Porter, who appears to her as a swashbuckling, radical man, and for which she sort of completely falls headlong, and then she marries him against her parents' wishes, departing from the family, breaking away from the family norms completely, breaking away from the kind of middle class, normative Britishness that she's so used to, accustomed to living. And she marries Jimmy, and she sort of settles down, or tries to settle down, as a working class housewife, a working class homemaker. Now, obviously, that doesn't work out. And I keep saying, the different, one of the many things which make Look Back in Anger such a complex play is the collusion between gender and class in Look Back in Anger. So, if you look at someone like Ma Tanner, who is the mother of Hugh Tanner in Look Back in Anger, she represents, or she embodies a pure working class woman who is sort of quote unquote ignorant, doesn't quite know, is not quite switched on about the worldly affairs around her. And obviously she's someone who Jimmy adores, but she also represents to a certain extent the dying purity of the working class. So there's no pure class left in Look Back in Anger. So there's no pure working class. This divide between the pure working class and the pure middle class is completely disappearing in Look Back in Anger. And obviously Alison, Hugh Tanner's mother, Ma Tanner, represents that kind of a dying class, that dying embodiment. So, and very symbolically she dies in Look Back in Anger. And her funeral, her death in Look Back in Anger is a very symbolic death, like the death of Jimmy Porter's father. Again, we never get to know the name of the person, but we get to know that he had been to the Spanish Civil War, came back as a broken man, ideologically broken, medically broken, and spent the rest of his life as a cynical, sick man. So again, this entanglement between cynicism and sickness in Look Back in Anger is interesting. And we talked about how Jimmy Porter's misogyny, the kind of hatred he has for a woman, it sort of stems from, to a certain extent, the trauma, the childhood trauma he had experienced. Listen to his dying father, rattling off about his unsuccessful life, this failure of a life from his deathbed, and the fact that he attended to him for 10 months, listening to him, this broken man, ideologically broken man, cynical man, sick man, that sort of informed this misogyny. And obviously there were no women around him at that point in time. So this absent mother figure in Look Back in Anger is again a very complex, absent presence. So she's there by not being there, in other words. So, and of course, we talked about how this connects Jimmy Porter with someone like Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, because again in Hamlet we find a certain degree of misogyny which comes from the mistrust of the woman. Hamlet cannot trust the woman. Hamlet is sort of threatened by the woman. So we find him vacillating between, the sort of being the son of a woman to being the lover of a woman, and can't quite come to terms with it. There's sort of imbalance as a man in that way. And I find a certain, similar kind of imbalance in Jimmy Porter as well. He's a very flawed character, and the complexity of the character lies in this flaw. The fact that he's so flawed makes him a very complex character. He's not really what you'd call a seamlessly manly man. So his masculinity or his manliness is something is sort of thwarted by his many hesitations, his neurotic behavior, and his ambivalence about different aspects of life. And of course, the class question keeps coming back in Jimmy Porter as well. So we keep saying how he wants to dress up. He wants to there's an aspirational quotient about the way he talks, about the way he dresses, and the way he smokes his pipe. the way he reads his newspapers, the way he listens to Vaughan Williams, so a very British composer. So all these things come together to make him some kind of an aspirational embodiment. So he is someone who's been to university, he's obviously got the rhetoric of an educated man, but doesn't obviously have the real substance to be middle class. So he's someone who's torn between being a working class and being a middle class. He can't go back being a working class person because he's too educated for it, and he can't be a pure middle class as well because he doesn't have the financial resources to be middle class as well. So again, this imbalance, this hesitation, this ambivalence, this sort of in-betweenness between two kinds of domains is what makes Jimmy Porter a very, very complex character. So again, coming back to Alison Redfern, so she can be seen as someone who's who's a receiver of violence. So she receives violence from her father, from her husband, from the society around her, and she sort of is someone who's completely confused. So she's probably the most confused character in Look Back in Anger. And obviously, she doesn't have the rhetoric of Jimmy. Despite being purely genteel, despite being really genteel, she doesn't have to go to university to be genteel. She was born into gentility. She doesn't quite have the rhetoric of Jimmy Porter, and so she becomes this very passive recipient of violence. And we find this degree of this vacillation between verbal violence and visceral violence is something which happens in Look Back in Anger quite often. And the body of the woman becomes, the site of violence. So Jimmy takes out his frustration, Jimmy takes out his anger of the world against the world, his cynicism against the world, his frustration against the world. He takes it out on the woman, on his wife. And again, we find this, this is a very long tradition of male behavior taking out violence on the woman. So, Alison Redfern becomes a way of the abused woman. So her body is abused, her presence is abused, her class is abused, her embodiment is abused, her very identity is abused in Look Back in Anger to a great extent. And obviously, she comes back having lost a child. She comes back, possibly, she possibly there's a hint of that she can't probably become a mother again. So she comes back with a certain degree of sickness, a certain degree of a medical condition in her, which makes her sort of traditional femininity sort of compromised to a certain extent. So, the abuse of Alison Redfern and Jimmy Porter, the violence against Alison Redfern and Jimmy Porter is verbal, is visceral, is medical, is cultural, and is deeply political as well. So she is someone who's completely unprotected. So she's not protected by her father, she's not protected by her husband, she's not protected by anyone. And if you leave aside this very stereotypical idea of the protected woman as well, she's someone who cannot articulate her anguish, she cannot articulate her identity in a straightforward way as well, because she lives in a very complex time in which her identity as an imperial woman will be immediately challenged and questioned. And on the other hand, she doesn't really have, unlike her father, she doesn't really have a glorious identity to fall back upon. So she sort of grew up in India as a daughter of the colonial officer, but she never quite did not really quite come to terms with power, with prestige, with dominance, with any kind of cultural identity. So she's somewhat of a floating signifier, if you may say that, right? And obviously her end is quite tragic. She comes back to Jimmy Porter having lost a child. She comes back to Jimmy Porter there's a possibility that she probably had lost the ability to become a mother again. So she comes back bodily abuse, she comes back in a medical condition, and she comes back completely broken. So again, if you look at the femininity of Alison Redfern and Look Back in Anger, it's a femininity which is sort of constructed by violence. Epistemic violence, verbal violence, and visceral violence. If we look at the rhetoric of Jimmy, which is directed against Alison, it's a very violent rhetoric. So the words are very violent, right? It is intended to hurt her. It's intended to insult her. It's intended to intimidate her. And we can do a very fine study of the rhetoric of Jimmy Porter as some kind of a masculine strategy, as some kind of a male strategy to attack the woman, right? So in order to attack the woman, you don't really have to be visceral all the time. You don't really have to be bodily all the time. Although it does become visceral at some point. If you remember, in the very opening of Look Back in Anger, the first act, which contains a scene where Jimmy and Cliff just start this mock wrestling thing, and they tumble into Alison, who happened to be ironing Jimmy's shirt at that point in time, and a very hot iron sort of brushed against her arm, which burned her arm. And again, obviously that becomes a very clear example of physical violence in Look Back in Anger, which had stemmed from this very violent rhetoric. So again, this vacillation between verbal and visceral violence in Look Back in Anger It's quite interesting. So the body of the woman becomes a site of violence, rhetorical violence, bodily violence, cultural violence, medical violence, all kinds of violence happen in Look Back in Anger, and the site of violence happens to be Alison Redfern. So she's someone who doesn't really have the grief of Jimmy Porter, because Jimmy uses his anger as some kind of a strategy. It's almost like a license for him to scream out to the world. And at what point of the play, Alison tells that don't take away his anger from him. He'll be lost without it. So the anger of Jimmy Porter becomes almost an apparatus, right? It's not just something it does at a human level, but also something it does at a discursive level. It's something which gives them a sort of a platform to lash out to the world, a sort of a platform to scream out his anguish. So again, and the rhetoric of Jimmy Porter is very cleverly engineered kind of rhetoric. It's very cleverly constructed rhetoric. It's sort of deliberately designed to be hurtful, to be insulting, to be intimidating, to be violent, right? So what I'm trying to say through this sort of last 10 minutes is the fact that just like we looked at the gendered quality of knowledge in Conrad's Heart of Darkness, one needs to look at the gendered quality of rhetoric and Look Back in Anger. The rhetoric of Jimmy Porter is a very male, violent rhetoric, which is deliberately designed to hurt the woman, to sort of inflict violence on the woman, right? And if you look at the very, very graphic bodily images that Jimmy Porter uses, especially when he's talking about his mother-in-law as being this sort of this very rotten body inside a system that worms are feeding him. It's very graphic. It's very it's very disturbing, it's very, very physical, it's very shocking, and it's very violent, right? Just try to imagine a body of a woman inside a cistern, a drain, which is being sort of eaten by worms, right? And that's not really an edifying image at all. It's something which is deeply depressing, disturbing, and sort of violent on a very visceral, verbal level. So again, this deliberate entanglement between the visceral and the verbal in Look Back in Anger is something that happens at a very gendered level as well. So Alison Redfern becomes the site of violence in Look Back in Anger. She becomes the receiver of violence, violence against a class, against a body, against her identity, against her appearance, against her language. All kinds of violence are directed against her. Now, if you come to Helena Charles from here, now who is Helena Charles in Look Back in Anger, and what is her gendered performative identity in Look Back in Anger? It's a very complex question, because remember, the first thing we need to know about Helena Charles is that she's a professional actress. She has come to London, especially, she's touring, she's sort of in the theatre company, touring London, and she apparently did not have a place to stay, so she sort of got in touch with Alison and moved into their apartment. And we see from the very beginning of Look Back in Anger, the moment Helena walks in to Jimmy Porter's household, we get to know that Jimmy hates Helena naturally. So he describes her as one of his natural enemies, because she represents the voice of establishment, the voice of middle-class establishment, the voice of middle-class morality, the voice of middle-class rhetoric, right? So she represents that value system, that establishment, that belief system. So she's deeply Christian as well, and at one point she takes Alison to the church on a Sunday against Jimmy's wish, and that's a very symbolic scene, because that's the scene also where Jimmy comes back having heard the news of Hugh Tanner's mother's stroke. So he wants Alison to come with him to the funeral, or to pay the last respects to Hugh Tanner's mother. But obviously Alison chooses to go to the church with Helena, which of course is a very symbolic choice, a very symbolic move, it's a very political move. So going to the church on a Sunday is going to the establishment, is going to sort of desiring to be accommodated by the establishment, right? Moving away from the anti-establishment that Jimmy wants to embody. So that becomes a very symbolic defeat for Jimmy Porter, okay? So that scene is a very symbolic scene where sort of Helena is seen dragging Alison, or seducing Alison to go back to establishment, to go back to the church, and of course she's instrumental in writing a letter to Alison's father advising him to come and pick her up. So Helena in many ways till this point can be described, can be classified as this very middle-class Christian presence in Look Back in Anger, who is obviously antagonistic to Jimmy Porter's anti-establishment radical rhetoric. She can't quite come to terms with it, although we get to know very soon, later, subsequently, that she is seduced by it, right? So she's someone who's tempted by it, she's someone who finds it deeply erotic at many levels. So you find that particular scene where Jimmy comes back after the departure of Alison, and Helena and Jimmy, they have a very interesting episode where they move from physical disgust and hatred to lust. very, very quickly, right? So we find that, Alison slaps Jimmy, and Jimmy wants to slap her back, but he cannot. And then, of course, Alison pulls him to her, and they start kissing passionately. So then the dramaticity of that scene, the immediacy of the scene lies in the fact that how quickly it spills over into a completely different kind of desire. Right, it's a kind of fascination from disgust to desire that we see in Look Back in Anger. Now, at the very beginning of the play, we had seen how Jimmy Porter was described as someone who is the constructive opposites, the constructive contradictions. So we find the same kind of contradictions coming together, even at the level of affect. So again, from disgust to desire, from hatred to lust. From a deeply worshipping kind of rhetoric to a deeply violent kind of rhetoric. And again, if you look at the relationship between Jimmy and Colonel Redfern, we find that there's a degree of empathy even beneath the antagonism that the two men have for each other. Okay, so all that is there in Look Back in Anger at a very gendered level. But what I'm trying to do today in this lecture is look at the very gendered quality of rhetoric in Look Back in Anger. How male is the anger in Look Back in Anger, and how deliberately designed is it in terms of language. So the linguistic design of the hatred, of the hate speech, if you sort of use that particular phrase in Look Back in Anger, is a very male kind of hate speech, which is directed obviously against the woman, against the body of the woman. And the woman is attacked over and over again in Look Back in Anger. So all the women who attacked in Look Back in Anger is Alison Redfern's mother, who is sort of described as this, very graphically as this massive body which is being eaten by worms. And of course, the other woman who, we have Martana, Hugh Tanner's mother, who dies in Look Back in Anger, and Jimmy Porter's mother, who never appears in the play except as a passing presence, as a passing reference, and a very, very unpleasant reference made by Jimmy. So where he says that, his mother was never there for him at a time where he needed her the most. So, the woman in Look Back in Anger, they have a very complex symbolism in the play. Now, the one woman who stands out among all the other figures in Look Back in Anger is Helena Charles. Now, and again, as I mentioned just a little while earlier, and also I believe I had mentioned this before in some of the lectures previously as well, that one needs to remember that Helena Charles is a professional actress. So performativity is something which comes naturally to her. So she's here to act in a particular play, and she sort of gets into the Porter household, and the first appearance we have of her is that of a, middle-class model woman. But obviously that quickly changes into something which is non-middle class, something which is manipulative, something which is seductive, and something, she becomes a woman who is quite content in being Jimmy's mistress. She has absolutely no qualms about him until the point that Alison comes back. And when Alison comes back to the Porter household, so Helena goes back suddenly into becoming the model woman again, and she sort of expresses and articulates the fact that she realizes what she had done is wrong and morally incorrect and unchristian. So again, it's very complex. So on the one hand, she starts off being this model Christian woman, and then she goes back and she breaks away from it and becomes Jimmy's mistress, and the two share a very erotic relationship, which has got nothing to do with the value system or the middle class morality. But then after Alison's reappearance in the play, Helena very quickly goes back and converts into this Christian middle class moral woman. So again, and that brings us to the other topic which I intend to cover in this play, the relationship between morality and gender in Look Back in Anger. So to what extent is morality gendered in Look Back in Anger, right? So we have, on the one hand, Jimmy Porter, who really and seemingly doesn't really care about morality or middle class morality. So he's supposed to have his own private morals, and that's what we keep saying, that's what we keep knowing about Jimmy, and other people tell the same thing about him, that he has his own private moral system which has got nothing to do with the Christian system or the middle class system whatsoever. But then again, we have the woman in Look Back in Anger. So we have Helena Charles, who starts off being this model woman and goes back being this sort of erotic seductress, the femme fatale, and then of course, she converts into this model Christian woman again at the end of the play. Now, the character in Look Back in Anger, I think, is very complex in terms of the morality, is obviously Alison Redfern. Now, Alison, as we know, she grew up in this sort of very privileged imperial household, this very privileged imperial family, and she was very used to being waited upon. And then suddenly she finds herself married to this working class hero, or someone who wants to be a working class hero, but obviously is a very violent man, someone who's misogynistic, someone who's carries his childhood trauma with him, and someone who subjects her to violence repeatedly, right? So she finds herself in a bit of no man's land. And obviously she also refers to Hugh Tanner, the more extreme version of Jimmy Porter, someone who doesn't appear in the play, Hugh Tanner, but we get to know of him that he's a deeply violent man who would put Jimmy to shame in terms of violence, in terms of this very masculine rhetoric of rage that Jimmy Porter has. So Hugh Tanner is a more extreme embodiment and a more extreme extension of Jimmy Porter in several ways, right? And again, we don't see him in the play. He doesn't appear in the play except as a passing reference. So he's among the many characters who don't appear in the play, including Jimmy Porter's father, Jimmy Porter's mother, Alison's mother, Ma Tanner, and of course Jimmy's dead child, who sort of appears and disappears and doesn't quite appear in the world, but he is sort of, the child is there as a symbolic non-presence at the end of the play, right? The fact that the child doesn't appear makes a certain kind of appearance and tells a certain kind of symbolic articulation in the context of the play, right? So that's something which we need to be careful about in the end as well. So the dead child of Jimmy Porter, to what extent is the dead child symbolic? To what extent is the non-appearance of the dead child a gendered phenomenon, right? To what does it say about the play, the politics of the play, the politics, the predicament of the play, the human predicament of the play? So does it point to a certain kind of futurelessness, a certain kind of human condition which is premised on futurelessness? Or does it sort of have some of the political suggestion in terms of imperial and post-imperial England? And it's something which is open-ended, and we never quite know, but it definitely points to certain kind of closure. There are two, Jimmy Porter and Alison Redfern, they go back playing the bear and squirrel game again, and of course the bear and squirrel game is a deeply gendered game as well, as we have discussed already, and we will discuss it further as we go on. But the dead child is a very symbolic non-presence in Look Back in Anger. It does say a lot by not appearing at all in the course of the play. Right. Now there are other characters which we had discussed in Look Back in Anger, and the people who play certain symbolic roles in terms of gendered identity, one of which is obviously Nigel Redfern, someone who is an embodiment of entitlement, someone who's just born into this wealthy family, and that's the only privilege that he has acquired, the privilege of birth, and that guarantees him a ticket to the parliament, that guarantees him a privileged access to politics, which someone like Jimmy Porter would never have, despite all the talents that Jimmy might have. So one wonders to what extent would Jimmy have been a successful or a good politician if he had a chance. But of course he never had a chance because he sort of stuck in this no man's land between the working class and the genteel class, which he cannot be, which he can never become, the genteel class. So, Look Back in Anger is a very complex muddle of all these different issues. It's a muddle of class, gender, and politics, rhetoric, sentiments. So all these things come together and Look Back in Anger and make it a deeply complex play, especially if you're looking at it from a gender studies perspective, right? Now, the other thing I want to move on today is we've covered the relationship between gender and rhetoric. We covered the relationship between gender and class earlier. We covered the relationship between gender and sentiment earlier. So to what extent is sentiment gendered in Look Back in Anger? So we have spoken about how anger is a very male sentiment in Look Back in Anger. So only the males seem to have access to anger. So Jimmy Porter is sort of consumed by anger, and he consumes anger in return. So anger is something of a commodity that he has, right? It stems from his grief, it stems from his sorrow, it stems from his sort of strategic sorrow, you might say. To a certain extent, we might compare him with Mansfield's boss in The Fly. So again, who is someone who's reliant on a strategic sorrow in order to articulate his kind of masculinity, right? So he's strategically sorrowful, he's strategically sad, because that gives him access to a certain kind of masculinity which he wants to produce and perpetuate in the course of the short story. Now, Look Back in Anger has a similar kind of condition. So we have Jimmy Porter, who is strategically sorrowful, who is someone who is angry all the time, but we never quite know to what extent is his anger constructed, to what extent is his anger a really organic condition, or is it a cultural condition, or is it a combination of the cultural and the organic? Is it a combination of the ideological, the cultural, and the organic, right? Because it's very interesting to see how quickly he loses his anger as well. So when he's very angry at Alison and he flares at her, and that particular scene where he jumps into her and she burns the arm in the iron, the hot iron, we see him very quickly becoming childlike. We see him very quickly becoming infantilized. So he, again, immediately becomes very concerned with Alison's hand, he becomes very concerned with Alison's hurt, her pain. So all the anger that he had just prior to the scene disappears immediately, right? So again, that begs the question, to what extent is Jimmy Porter's anger, natural and organic? Or is it just a rhetorical strategy, a strategy of procrastination, a strategy of denial, a strategy of privilege? Because, the anger gives him a certain kind of privilege, if you remember King Lear, which has this interesting line called "anger hath a privilege," and that's something we need to remember if you read Look Back in Anger as well, because anger does have a certain kind of privilege in Look Back in Anger, in a very King Learish kind of a way. But of course, with Jimmy Porter, he's just the antithesis of King Lear. He's someone who's not been in a dominant position. He's someone who's never been in a position of privilege, so he doesn't know what privilege is. So he can only aspire for privilege. He can only aspire for dominance through anger. So anger becomes a male strategy of aspiration. It's like Jimmy Porter's torn tweed jacket, sort of the pipe he's smoking, and the news of the world that he's reading. So all these things come together metonymically to construct a certain kind of masculinity that he aspires to become, a genteel kind of masculinity, despite his working class privilege, a working class background. Okay, so we talked about that to a great extent earlier as well. Now, if you look at the other minor characters in Look Back in Anger, for instance, Colonel Redfern is someone who doesn't have to be aspirational, doesn't have this anxiety to be aspirational, because he is automatically guaranteed a license and a location in gentility because of his birth, because of his colonial background. Right? So that makes him, interestingly, a genteel person, but then again we discuss how that also makes him more confused cognitively and politically, because he comes back to an England he doesn't recognize. He comes back to an England where his authority is increasingly questioned. No longer does he have any kind of privileged location in this England. It's a post-imperial England, and that makes him sort of a minority to a certain extent. So again, we have this very interesting move from being a hegemonic masculine presence to a minor presence who is increasingly challenged and questioned and marginalized in that kind of a class structure. So if we take, we have already discussed all this, and now if we just move on and plunge into the last bit of the play, where Helena Charles becomes Jimmy's mistress, and we see them establish a very erotic relationship where they seem to be quite happy with each other at a pure level of lust, and Jimmy doesn't seem to expect much from Helena, certainly not to the extent to which he had expected from Alison, and he says that quite clearly to Cliff at some point in the play, that his expectations from Helena are quite limited. It's essentially a sexual erotic expectation that he has from Helena, nothing more than that. Now, what I would like to do at this point is to focus on a Jimmy-Cliff relationship and Look Back in Anger. So to what extent is that relationship just a relationship of friendship, or is there any homoerotic perspective, any homoerotic component that's touched upon in the play but not explored, obviously, right? Now, it's a very open question. It's a very open kind of an argument to make, and one can never really come to a closure. One can never really come to a conclusion about this particular topic. Now, from the description we have of Hugh Tanner, which is something that Alison gives us, Hugh Tanner being this extreme alpha male that Jimmy sort of worships, but at the same time he treats Hugh as some kind of a toy, and when he introduced Hugh and Alison to each other, it seemed as if to Alison that he was showing off two toys to each other. So again, that particular bit in Look Back in Anger is quite complex, because that sort of hints at the possibility of maybe some kind of a homoerotic tension, a homoerotic angle between Jimmy and Hugh. And remember this nonsense rhyme, this nonsense poem that Jimmy sang at one point in time in Look Back in Anger, where he says quite clearly, "I'm tired of being a hetero, rather ride on a metro," where he sort of talks about celibacy, his hatred of women, his misogyny, and how there are occasions where he says that he's envious of the Greek chorus boys to Androgyde, because these people, the Greek chorus boys, obviously represent or symbolize homosexuality. Androgyde, and the playwright, the French playwright, he was a homosexual. So these references, these allusions in Look Back in Anger, these homoerotic allusions in Look Back in Anger, opens it up even further from the perspective of gender studies. So to what extent is Jimmy's anger a bit of a disguise for homoeroticism? Maybe he's trying to masquerade as this angry alpha male who is actually a homosexual, but he can't really come out of his closet. That's the possibility which is sort of hinted at in Look Back in Anger, but never quite articulated in the course of the play, like many other things. And these are the things which make the play so interesting and complex, because we have these hints, we have these very subtle suggestions, we have this sort of very little insights into people's minds, into people's sentiments, emotions, without really articulating what they are totally feeling. So this lack of totality in the play at a symbolic, dramatic level, but also level of embodiment and level of characterization is what makes the play a very, very complex piece of theatre. We never quite know the motives of the characters, we never quite know what drives the characters, what makes them angry, what makes them passive, what makes them happy, what makes them melancholy. So these are things which are, there's no objective correlative to a certain extent to some of the sentiments that Look Back in Anger. And in some sense, Look Back in Anger may be read as something, as a piece of drama which appears to anticipate absurdist theatre. Because remember, this is the time, 1956, which is sort of the beginning of the absurdist movement in theatre. So very quickly we'll have Waiting for Godot in the next few years, and we have this sort of rich range of absurdist dramatists who will come in, who will break away from the normative tradition of sentiments, articulation, logic, etc. So Look Back in Anger toys with logic on certain occasions. So Look Back in Anger toys with normativity at a certain point in the play. It toys with normative understandings of gender and gendered behavior and gendered articulation at various points in the play, right? And that's what makes the play a very, very interesting piece of study, especially if you're looking at it from a gender studies perspective, right? So melancholia in Look Back in Anger is very masculine melancholia. The anger in Look Back in Anger is very masculine anger. So anger becomes a strategy, a verbal device, to attack, to sort of defend the man, to sort of create this politics of denial, this politics of procrastination that Jimmy has, because we never quite see him do anything. And obviously, as a feminist, the obvious question that one should ask, is that why does it take it out on a woman? Because his entire frustration, his social frustration, his professional frustration, his lack of success socially, culturally, he seems to take it out on the woman. So again, the woman's body becomes the vessel, not just of violence, but also against masculine unfulfillment, right? The fact that he cannot fulfill himself as a man, socially, professionally, that becomes, so that is transferred onto the body of the female, which accounts for the visceral violence in Look Back in Anger, which is sort of packed into the verbal strategies, the verbal rhetoric in the play as the play progresses. So all these things come together to make this play a really complex study of gender. Now coming on to, moving on to this Jimmy-Alison relationship, and from there to Jimmy-Helena relationship. So as I mentioned, Helena Charles becomes a very clear embodiment of performativity in the play, because she sort of appears as a professional actress and then becomes Jimmy's seductress and becomes his mistress, and then goes back to being the Christian woman, the model Christian woman, all very quickly in the course of the play. Again, dramatizing this very complex relationship between gender and moral values and value system and morality and Christianity, etc. Right? So let's look at the scene where Alison comes back in the play, right, having lost a child and the possibility of becoming a mother again. So she comes back completely broken in a way which is not dissimilar to the kind of brokenness Jimmy experienced when he saw his father dying after the Spanish Civil War. So the Spanish Civil War may be read as a political phenomenon which broke Jimmy Porter's father. It broke him medically, culturally, ideologically, and at a human level. And the violence that Alison goes through, the violence that Alison experiences as a woman in Look Back in Anger, breaks her as well. But the interesting thing is the very masculinist kind of take that Alison's experience, appears to have. So she comes back almost apologetically to Jimmy, saying that she's hoping that Jimmy would take her back. She's hoping that Jimmy would understand and empathize with her now that she's suffered So again, her whole suffering seems to be mediated by the male gaze, which is a very problematic thing, right? Because that completely effaces or takes away her female agency, right? So as a feminist, one would be really outraged at this kind of a reading of Look Back in Anger, where the woman comes back having lost a child and apologizes to her husband and tells him that now I'm equal to you, now you can treat me as an equal because I have suffered. I have known what suffering is, and I've learned this lesson in life, which makes me an equal, which makes me your match right now. And the husband takes her back very, very graciously, thinking that now she is fit enough, or superior enough, or having suffered enough, she is human enough to be taken as a wife. Now, this reading is deeply sexist, it's deeply misogynistic, it's deeply problematic at various levels. But that is a reading which does happen in Look Back in Anger. That seems to be on the surface, when Alison comes back and begs Jimmy to understand her and tells him that she's hoping now that Jimmy would know that she has suffered quite as much as he did, and so she understands what suffering is. So suffering again becomes a very gendered phenomenon. This is the point that I'm trying to I was trying to come at, and now I'll spend a little bit of time talking about this connecting it to the way how rage, anger is gendered, how rhetoric is gendered, how language is gendered, and Look Back in Anger. So suffering too becomes a very gendered phenomenon. So suffering is something which is only experienced, which can only be understood in completion by the male in Look Back in Anger. That appears to be the reading. So again, this is rampant sexism. Just like language is male, violence is male, the rhetoric of rage is male, suffering too becomes almost a sacred male experience. Jimmy had suffered, and that had apparently elevated him as a human being. So he had suffered the death of his father. So again, it's a complete male circuit of suffering, right? So the dying father had sort of talked to the lost or confused child, confused boy, and the two men shared a certain kind of suffering, a certain structure of suffering, which elevates Jimmy Porter, apparently elevates Jimmy Porter as some kind of a superior human being. Now, Alison, having lost a child, so she sort of says that I too have suffered now, so I too am male enough to a certain extent to be accommodated, to be loved by Jimmy Porter. And that kind of reading, which is something which happens a lot in Shakespeare's plays. So, you find in Shakespeare's plays, certain times very problematic male relationships are formed around women, where women are used as sort of commodities, as buffers, as connecting links between men, between manly sentiments. And a classic case in point is Merchant of Venice, where the relationship between Antonio and Bassanio, which is quite clearly a homoerotic relationship, is mediated through the woman, to the woman's body, to the woman's appearance. And of course, as you know, those of us who've read the play know that at the end of the play, where Bassanio gives away his wedding ring to Portia, who's disguised as Balthazar, that symbolically reveals quite clearly that he is quite prepared to let go of his heterosexual bond, of his marriage contract with a woman for the sake of the male lover, right? So that completely jeopardizes the erotic economy in Merchant of Venice. Like many of Shakespeare's plays, the erotic economy in Merchant of Venice is very plastic, it's very superficial, it's very fragile. We talked a little bit about Twelfth Night earlier as a subtext in the course of this play, in the course of this particular course, and we've seen how Twelfth Night too is a very interesting play in that respect. Now, a similar kind of thing happens in Look Back in Anger as well. So the reading that Alison supposedly gives at the end of the play to Jimmy when she comes back is the fact that she has suffered now, and she's suffered enough to be manly, she's suffered enough to be counted as Jimmy's companion, right? And Jimmy can take her now because she has elevated herself through suffering. The suffering, physical suffering, spiritual suffering, emotional suffering, all these become very, very male strategies of superiority, very, very male strategies of elevation, right? And that is deeply problematic because we have seen how Alison has suffered physically, verbally, viscerally in the course of the play. But that did not count as suffering because that came from Jimmy Porter. So suffering is something which happens internally, and that internal suffering through the process of losing one's child, which is obviously a traumatic experience, that makes that sort of mans her up to a certain extent, and that makes a fit companion, a compatible companion to Jimmy Porter, which is again a very deeply problematic reading in Look Back in Anger, right? So again, this is a point that I want to sort of stress a little bit, how suffering is gendered in Look Back in Anger, and to what extent is that is connected to rage, to anger, to the other effects in the play, which are deeply gendered as well, right? So when Alison comes back at the end of the play, what we find is a very interesting conversation between the two women. And again, the fact that Jimmy occupies the entire space, the entire verbal space between the two women shows the gender politics in Look Back in Anger, which is a deeply masculine kind of a politics, where the male is always present, where the male never goes away, even when the two women talk to each other, confide to each other. It is always about the man. It's always about the man in the other room who's playing a trumpet or has gone out or whatever, right? So the man is always present. So he's like this overseeing presence in Look Back in Anger. Jimmy Porter, he never leaves the room symbolically. He's always there in the room and Look Back in Anger. And that makes them a really, sort of dominant, overseeing, omnipotent, omnipresent male character in the play. So when the two women talk to each other, it's very interestingly, they tell each other, they agree with each other that Jimmy is born, way out of his time. So he's someone who should be born, they say, during the time of French Revolution, during the time of great political movements, where he would have excelled, he would have flourished as a figure, right? But because he's living in a time which doesn't offer him the opportunity for political action, he's sort of dwindled and he's claustrophobic, and he's suffering because of that, which obviously is not quite true at all, because as I mentioned at the very beginning of the play, this play was written at the time where some very important political events were taking place. This was the beginning of the Cold War. This was the time of the Suez Canal crisis, where this virtual war between England and Egypt was taking place because of President Nasser's decision to block the Suez Canal for the British ships. This is a time which was the beginning of the Falklands War between England and Argentina. So there are certain very interesting and important, significant political events happening at that point of time. It's just that Jimmy doesn't engage with those political levels, with those political actions. There's no mention of any of these events in the play. And all he does is he looks back in a very romantic, reified kind of a past. Now I use the word reified deliberately over here. This is what Jimmy does. So he takes the past as one monolithic organic entity where everything was rosy and nice and lovely, and he compares that to his very, very disappointing and depressing present, and which he finds completely insufficient for his masculinity, which is obviously a very strategic thing, because if he really engages with the present, there are things he can engage with and Look Back in Anger. There are certain political phenomena which he can engage with quite easily in the course of the play, but it doesn't. So what does he do instead? He does a sort of a denial strategy. He does a very strategic kind of a prevaricative method whereby he completely converts the past as one organic, monolithic, rosy entity where everything was abundant, everything was lovely, everything was flourishing, and he compares and contrasts that to the very, very sorry present in which he finds himself to be living and suffering. And the women seem to subscribe to this. So Alison and Helena, they talk to each other, and they seem to subscribe to this appearance of Jimmy, that he's someone who's born out of his time, like Hamlet. And we get to see this thing about Hamlet as well, that he sort of pretends to be someone who was born either ahead of his time or after his time. And it doesn't quite fit in a temporal landscape of Denmark that he finds himself inhabiting. And we find a similar kind of situation in Look Back in Anger, where Jimmy Porter doesn't seem to fit in the temporal landscape or the temporal cosmos of England, which doesn't really offer him any opportunity to be glorious, to be heroic, to be whatever, right? And he says at one point in the play that if you die over here, it will not be a glorious death anymore. It will be like stepping in front of a bus. It's as inglorious, as banal, as mundane as stepping in front of a bus. So all the brave good causes are gone. There are no brave good causes left. In other words, he says quite clearly through this particular line that he cannot really become a masculine hero anymore. So the possibility of heroic masculinity is frustrated. The possibility of heroic masculinity is gone. in the course of the play because of the political conditions in which he finds himself stuck in. Now that is obviously a very, very complex thing to say, because the women subscribe to it, the women support him, the women say he should have been born in the French Revolution. They can picture him as a crusader for liberty, equality, fraternity, and all the lovely things of the French Revolutions. So he fits into that particular image quite easily. But he seems to be struggling to come to terms with his present, and they agree, the two women, that will never do anything, never amount to anything, right? So again, the insufficient masculinity of Jimmy Porter, the inglorious masculinity of Jimmy Porter, is sort of defended to a certain extent by relocating him into some kind of a rosy past where he could have been someone. Well, obviously we'd never know whether he could have been that. We never know, we will never know whether he could have been a crusader, whether he could have been a radical, whether he could have been a hero. He probably wouldn't have become a hero in any circumstances, because there are certainly opportunities for him to engage in political action at this present as well, but he doesn't do it. He screams from his armchair, he subjects his wife to violence, verbal violence, visceral violence, and he keeps sort of condensing the past into one organic entity of rosy revolutions and opportunities which are exhausted now. And the present he looks at the present as some kind of an exhausted entity, which he finds himself completely stuck in. So again, it's interesting to see how even time is gendered and looked back in anger, right? The past is a male past, right? The past is a space for possibilities, for promises, for revolutions, for abundance, for lovely things, things which are gone now, right? So the present right now is insufficient. The present is sort of quote unquote emasculated. The present is a space for frustration, for cynicism, etc. Right? So again, this is deeply gendered. So the potency of the past is sort of deliberately contrasted with the importance of the present. Right? And this is the imagination of Look Back in Anger, the imagination of Jimmy Porter in Look Back in Anger, which the women in Look Back in Anger also seem to subscribe to. But we need to look at a play from a more complex perspective. We need to step out of the mindscape of Jimmy Porter and look at the play from outside his mind, to really locate him, to really situate him in his present, and to sort of study him as a gendered phenomenon, in terms of his negotiation with the present. So to what extent does it negotiate with his present, politically, emotionally, at an existential level? Does it really engage with the present at all? Does it negotiate with the present at all? Or does it take it out? Does it take out his failure, his bitterness, his cynicism on the most easily available side, which is the body of the woman, which is really something which is attacked over and over again in Look Back in Anger, verbally, viscerally, culturally, emotionally, in all sorts of ways, right? That sort of culminates into the loss of Alison's child, the fact that she loses the ability to produce a child. She goes through a miscarriage, and we were given a hint that she will probably never become a mother again. So this attack on the woman, this violence on the woman, this becomes sort of quite symbolically present in Alison's condition at the end of the play. So Alison's condition at the end of the play may be seen, may be read as an example of the violence on the woman, the violence suffered by the woman, but also notice how, as was mentioned just a little while earlier, how this violence suffered by the woman is sort of made sacred to a certain extent and articulated by the woman herself, which is even deeply shocking in the context of Look Back in Anger. So she sort of comes back to Jimmy and says, now that I've suffered, now that I've gone through a really deep spiritual suffering, physical, emotional, medical, spiritual suffering, now probably I can be a compatible companion for you. You, the great man, you should take me back. You should sort of accommodate me back. Now I'm a fitting companion for you, having suffered. So again, look at the way how the violence on a woman is almost legitimized, and it almost becomes a necessary, compulsory condition for the elevation of the woman. It's almost like a lesson of the woman, right? The lesson the woman needs to go through, the lesson the woman needs to experience in order to be as good as men, as good as the protagonist, the manly protagonist in the play. Now this deeply sexist, problematic, misogynistic reading of Look Back in Anger is something which we must resist. And this is the reason why I'm saying one needs to step out of Jimmy Porter's imagination and look at the play from a broader cultural, political perspective as a play of lost opportunities, but also of violences. And the chief recipient of the violence in Look Back in Anger is the woman, is Alison Redfern, who I think personally is the most complex character in the play, the most helpless character in the play, the most tragic character in the play in Look Back in Anger. And the tragedy lies in the fact, exactly the fact that she doesn't quite know, she doesn't see herself as a tragic character. And also notice the way in which there's an attempt made by the woman again, ironically, to confer the tragic hero status on Jimmy Porter in the end. So they're sort of telling each other that, he should have been born at the time of French Revolution, he should have been Napoleon Bonaparte, he should have been Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Alison at some point says that he wanted to be Shelley and he doesn't understand why I am not Mary Shelley and you're not William Godwin. This is what she says to her father. So again, the whole attempt made by the play, at least on a superficial level, is to glorify Jimmy, is to romanticize Jimmy as this misdirected, misfired, masculine presence. But if you read the play from an objective gender perspective, from a broader, a more complex gender perspective, we find that this is an attempt made by the man really to cover up for his own inadequacies, to confer his inadequacies on the woman, to transform his failure into violence, to transform his inadequacies, his bitterness, his lack of success, social success, professional success, onto the body of the woman, right, who becomes a very passive recipient of it, and also to a certain extent subscribes to it, right. So she sort of subscribes to this kind of transferring strategy by the male. And the heroism in Look Back in Anger is sort of almost entirely centered on Jimmy Porter, which again is deeply problematic because, if you read the play from a complex gender perspective, the most tragic character is undoubtedly Alison Redfern in Look Back in Anger. But we don't see that in the end. The ending of Look Back in Anger is sort of very, very assiduously tries to sort of make Jimmy into some kind of a tragic hero, some kind of a romantic tragic hero who can now live a life of resignation, of submission, having lost a glorious battle, etc. Now, all this taken together is, in my mind, a cover-up, really, for sort of a cover-up for the inadequacies of Jimmy's gendered identity, right? So he becomes a failed father, he becomes a failed husband, he becomes a failed professional, and he becomes a failed person at an existential level. Now all these failures are so transferred over to the woman very conveniently, and ironically this kind of transfer is subscribed by the woman and voiced and articulated by the woman at the end of Look Back in Anger. So, taken together, a failure becomes a gendered phenomenon, right? So the man can never fail. As failure is quickly transferred over to the woman, who now looks at the failure as some kind of a spiritual elevation for her to come to terms with the man, to become as good as a man, to become as spiritual as a man, to become as existentially rich as a man. And now she comes back and sort of reconciles and begs admission to the man as well, who happily takes her back. Right? Now this kind of reading is obviously deeply problematic, offensive at many levels, but I think this is a reading which we need to do in Look Back in Anger, rather than read the play as some kind of a romantic ending where Alison and Jimmy get back to each other. We need to understand the suffering of the woman. We need to understand how the suffering is sort of how the woman really doesn't see that as a suffering. She sees that as an elevation because she's brainwashed into doing it by the man. She sees that as an elevation for her to become as good as a man. And that's sort of in her mind that makes her a sort of a deserving, an accommodating person, that makes her someone who can come back to Jimmy Porter and be as good as Jimmy, which is a very deeply problematic thing in my mind. Right? So again, one needs to look back in anger from these various perspectives of gender and gender identity, not just a level of identity, but also a level of affect, at the level of emotion, the level of sentiment. So how do sentiments in Look Back in Anger become deeply gendered and mapped across in a very deeply gendered kind of a way? Sentiments such as resignation, pain, loss, alienation. How do these things become conveniently gendered and Look Back in Anger? And how the whole play in the end tries to make Jimmy into some kind of a tragic character and some kind of a tragic hero, which it clearly isn't in my mind, right? The only tragic character in Look Back in Anger, the most tragic character perhaps in Look Back in Anger, is Alison Redfern, and the tragedy is she doesn't know it, right? So this concludes this lecture. We'll have one more lecture on Look Back in Anger and we will just discuss the play overall as a gendered phenomenon, and we'll obviously sort of reiterate some of the things which I've already said, but we'll also connect it to some of the plays like Ibsen's Doll's House, and also some of the absurdist plays which will come up later in the works of Samuel Beckett, Eugene Ionesco, and Harold Pinter. But this is something I've mentioned in passing today, how Look Back in Anger appears to anticipate at a dramatic level, a theatrical level, these absurdist experiments with theatre which would come up in subsequent years. But in the next lecture, I'll connect Look Back in Anger to some of the social, gendered issues in theatre which were pervading European theatre even before Look Back in Anger. I'll mention Ibsen's Doll's House to a certain extent, but also look at how at a former innovative level, Look Back in Anger is a very important play, especially in the way it sort of has a very complex manifestation of gender, not just a level of identities, but also a level of sentiments, apparatus, rhetoric, emotions, and affect overall in the course of the play. Right? So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you in the next class where we conclude Look Back in Anger as a drama. Thank you.